I'm Ellie Beaver. I'm the Government Relations Director for the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network here in Minnesota. And I'm here to talk to you today about advocacy and how you can be an advocate for issues that are important to you. I've been the Government Relations Director for the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, or ACS-CAN, for 3 years, and before that was a grassroots organizer for our organization. So my presentation is called The Art of the Possible, Using Your Voice to Make Political Change. This is a part of a quote from Otto von Bismarck, who was a German diplomat who in the second half of the 19th century was well known for building coalitions and pushing policies in Europe that benefited his point of view. And he was somebody who subscribed to the idea that politics is about being pragmatic, that you work with what you have to get what you need done, instead of focusing on, say, an ideology or ideals for the work that you're trying to accomplish. Oh, that's... there we go. So my goals for you for today is to be able to describe what it means to be an advocate, to learn the basic structure of the federal and state government, to understand how to contact your lawmaker and who to contact, and then to instill confidence in you and your ability to share your story. I do a presentation like this with our new advocates, and it's like a 6-hour presentation, so I'm trying to condense it down into 45 minutes. So it'll probably be, might be a little fast. I tried to be as clear about things as possible, and it's condensed information. And it might be basic for some folks that have done some maybe working with their elected officials. But if I'm going too fast or if you have questions, please let me know. So this is the dictionary, the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of advocacy. An advocate, the act or process of supporting a cause or proposal, the act or process of advocating for something. And then an advocate to advocate is just to support or argue for or to plead in favor of. I'd also argue you can advocate against something, but perhaps that's just advocating for the opposite position. The reason I wanted to show you the definition is because I think a lot of times people are intimidated by advocacy. They hear that word and they think of like protests or lobbyists, or they think of like a specialized role like a patient advocate that shepherds someone through the medical process. But advocacy is something that all of us do every day in big and small ways. Anytime you're trying to get somebody to move closer to your side in an argument, or to your point of view, or to move them to do something that maybe they don't exactly want to do, you're being an advocate. You're advocating for something. For example, this is my daughter during her second dentist visit. Her first one was a disaster. She wouldn't even go into the room. And so the poor hygienist had to like stand out in the hall with her and count her teeth while she was sobbing. So in order to convince her when we went back that she should get in this chair, we talked about it for weeks beforehand, and I talked about how cool it was to be able to sit in this chair, and I got in that chair before she got in it, and I was like, look how fun this is. And so eventually got her in that chair, got her cleaning, she's smiling. She was not too unhappy about it. And then, the best part was I promised her a cookie and hot chocolate afterwards. So, sorry, dental hygienist, but eventually got her to get into that chair. And that's advocacy. And I want you to think of advocating to your elected officials in a similar way. You're making the case. You're telling them why this is a positive thing. What's the benefits of it? And eventually you're going to get them to get in that chair. So that's just an example of advocacy in everyday life. So this is the definition of advocacy that we use, that we're trying to influence those who make policies that affect our lives, And activities can include visiting lawmakers, writing emails, letters, making phone calls, posting on social media. There's a lot of different ways to be an advocate. One of the important things that a lot of organizations like mine and those of you that are in this room bring to advocacy is that as nonprofits or hospitals and clinics, you can bring information about evidence-based practices. You've got the science behind the recommendations that you're making, and that's really important and makes your message more legitimate. Some potential roadblocks to advocacy include things like lack of comfort with the process. It can be very intimidating to talk to elected officials. I think a lot of folks feel like they don't know enough about policy or know enough about the process to feel comfortable, and that means that it's not something you want to do. You don't know where to start. You don't know who to talk to, who to call, when to call them. You don't know where to get help. And you don't feel like you're enough of an expert to advocate. You feel like you've got to have some sort of special expertise in politics or policy in order to do that. And I'm here to tell you that that is not true. So we'll talk about a little bit about the structure of government. So this is going to be like a 8th grade social studies recap. So we'll start with what the structure of government is. So government usually has 3 different branches, right? The legislative body, which makes laws, the executive branch, which includes the head of state and the departments that they oversee as well, and so they execute and enforce the laws, and then the judicial branch, which interprets the law. So there's many layers of government in this country, and most of them are structured this way, where they've got these 3 branches, which, you know, if you remember from social studies, it's the checks and balances on each other. And then I also want to talk a little bit about what a law is, right? Because we know that like laws are things we have to obey. Laws are things that the police enforce. But really, the basic thing of what a law is it's how we, the people, tell the government what we want them to do. And that's really, at the heart of it all, that's what a law is. And when you are participating in advocating for a bill that might become a law, you're really participating in the most basic process in American democracy, and that is to petition your government for change. So the law, legal things might sound big and scary, but really it's at its heart, it's about you telling the government what you want them to do. So at the federal level, the legislative body is Congress with a House and Senate. The executive branch is the president and then all the departments that he oversees. And the judicial branch is the federal court system. And so we'll be talking about the legislative branch, and we'll be focused at the state level. Did that work? Yeah. So in Congress, at the federal level, we have 435 representatives and 100 senators. They do their business in Washington, D.C. In Minnesota, in that system, we have 2 senators, Amy Klobuchar and Tina Smith, and then we have 8 representatives. Every state has 2 senators, and then every state has representatives based on their population. In Minnesota, we have 8 districts, so we have 8 representatives, and senators serve 6-year terms, representatives serve 2-year terms. And then I'm sure everybody's been hearing all about the elections. You've been seeing the ads on television. Normally, our representatives, they run every election cycle. So every 2 years, they're up for re-election. And then senators have staggered terms, except in Minnesota this year, very unusually, we have both of our senators up for election, and you might be wondering why that is. And that's because when Senator Al Franken resigned, Tina Smith was appointed, and in order to technically fill out the rest of Senator Franken's term, she has to run for a special election. So probably never again will we see both of Minnesota's senators running in the same year, but we are this year, so there's a lot of people on the ballot to know about. And just to add more excitement to it, At least 3 of our representatives will not be in Congress next year, so we'll have at least 3 new representatives out of our 8, and there's a couple other districts that have a high probability of flipping, so there might be even fewer of these folks left, and we'll have new folks to talk to. So in Minnesota, we have a similar structure for our government where we have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. In our legislature, we also have a House and Senate, so similar to the federal structure. It's called the legislature. Our executive branch is run by the governor and the state agencies that he oversees, and then our judicial branch is the state court system. The difference between the federal level and the state level, as far as your representation is in Minnesota, you have 1 state senator and 1 state representative. So those districts, again, like at the federal level, for the representatives and senators, are determined by the population of the state and then divided into districts. And so each Senate district contains 2 House districts. Does anybody, just yell it out, do you guys know what's the name of your state senator and state representative? Anyone? Say that? Nice. Sit. Nice. Anyone else know who your state representatives are? All right. Well, I'm going to tell you how to find out. If you don't know who represents you, you can go to, this is my favorite site to use because it's the one that's the state of Minnesota hosts. There's lots of different sites that you can use to look up who your representatives are, but this one's our homegrown site. That's the website, or you can just search for who represents me, MN Ledge, and you put your address in there, and it'll show you exactly who represents you in the state legislature. It looks like this. So I typed in this address so we could see who represents us right here, and we've got, we're in District 35B, so Peggy Scott is our representative, Jim Abler is our senator, Tom Emmer is our Congress member, so who sits in Washington, D.C., and then Klobuchar and Smith are our senators. And it gives you a nice map of your district, and then if you click on any of those boxes, you can see their contact information, which makes it really easy for you to reach out if you've got something to say to them. So we all know, most of us know, Schoolhouse Rocks and the I'm Just a Bill song, and we might be able to sort of sing part of it, but I'm sure it doesn't make the legislative process much clearer to people. And so I fully admit that it's a very complicated process. That's a sort of actually kind of a slimmed down diagram of what the process is that a bill has to go through in order to pass. On average, it takes about 7 years for a bill to go from, hey, I've got this great idea, to being signed into law by a governor. And that takes, that varies based on the bill, right? So maybe if it's something that needs a lot of money or might be controversial, it could take longer. If it's something that's pretty, widely supported, doesn't cost much, and people generally agree that it's a good idea, it might just take a session or 2. So I thought we'd maybe just walk a bill through the process. And I'm gonna propose a bill to make February 17th, which is my birthday, I Love Oral Health Day in Minnesota. So we wanna have that day be Oral Health Day in Minnesota. So we're gonna take this bill and walk it through from beginning to end. So this is a bit clearer version of the legislative process. So better than our map with all those arrows crossing every which way. So basically every bill starts with an idea. You've got a great idea that you think, having the government make that change is the right way to go. And so this is my idea, to have an I Love Oral Health Day. So I'm gonna go try and find somebody in the legislature to introduce that bill. You've gotta have a representative in the legislature be the one to introduce your bill. You can't walk onto the floor and say, here's my great idea. You've got to have one of them do it. You've got to have the language drafted, so somebody in the revisor's office who writes all the bills has to help you figure out what the language needs to look like. And then you identify your author. So you might want to look for somebody that is also really excited about oral health to be your author. Somebody who might be a dental hygienist or a dentist, or be married to a dentist or an oral hygienist to be able to also get excited about your bill and push it through. And then it has to be introduced. So once you've identified your author and you've got your language, they have to you literally like walk up to this basket in the Capitol. It's called a hopper, and you put it in there, and that's like how you get your bill into the queue to get introduced. And so it's not as intimidating, I think, as a lot of people think. You just walk up to a basket. But then it gets introduced, and now it has to go somewhere. It goes into a committee. So before it gets to the floor, for everybody to vote on, it's got to go through a committee that is, has oversight of that issue. So something like an oral health bill might go through a Health and Human Services committee because it's a statewide day. It might go through the state and local government committee. It might go through government operations. So a bill can go through multiple committees before it gets to the point where everybody's voting on it. So, this bill might go to the Health and Human Services Committee. They'd be like, yeah, this is a great idea. And then it would go to maybe the Government Operations Committee. And maybe they're like, there's too many state days. We don't know about this. So we might have to spend some time convincing some folks that, no, this actually is a great idea. And then from there, they might say, okay, we agree with you, and we might send it to the floor for a vote in one house. And so it would go to the floor for a vote, and we're hoping that same process is happening in the other body. So it might be going through the House at the same time it's going through the Senate. They might send it to different committees in each body, which is, always baffling. And then it gets to the floor on the House and the Senate, and they vote on it. And we'll say they thought it was a great idea, and so it passes unanimously. But now it has to go to this conference committee to make sure that both versions of that bill are the same. So you can amend a bill at any point in that committee process. And so a lot of times they come out of those committees looking different. And so when they get voted on the floor, they are different bills that they're voting on. And so we go to conference committee to make those bills look the same. So those are committees made up of House and Senate members. They make those bills look the same. They vote on them. They send them back to the floor in identical versions. The House and Senate votes on them, and then they're on their way to the governor, who can either sign them or veto them. And so that's the whole process in a very, very abbreviated way. At every point in this process, my bill has the opportunity to either move forward or it can fail. If at any point the committee or the floor doesn't have a 50% plus one margin to pass something, then it's dead, which means you have to come back and try again next session or next biennium. That's another thing I should say. The Minnesota legislature, just like Congress, has a 2-year cycle. So we'll be on January 1st of 2019, we'll be starting a brand new legislative biennium. So that means you can introduce a bill in January of 2019, and as long as it doesn't die sometime during that session, you still have a bill on January 1st of 2020, and you have a whole other year to try and pass that bill. Which is sometimes an important thing that I like to remind our volunteers to remember when we get to the end of a legislative session and we haven't, finished passing our bill. It's like, we got another chance, another year. Same thing with Congress. So that's the legislative process in a nutshell. Does anybody have any questions about that or anything else?
If you get to the end of a session and it's the end of that biennium, do you have to start all over? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so thank you. If you get to the end of a biennium and your bill hasn't passed, then you'd have to start all over the next year where you'd reintroduce it, it'd get a new number, you'd have to go drop it in that basket again. You might even need to get new authors because an election might have changed who's in charge or who your author, or if your author even sits in that seat anymore. Any other questions? Yeah. Sorry. A housekeeping bill. So the question is, what is a housekeeping bill? I think when we refer to a housekeeping bill, we're referring to something that's like cleaning up language. So, a lot of times, you might have heard during like last session, we went to the very end, and there was this big bill that had a bunch of language in it. It was like 1,000 pages long. It ended up going to the governor and being vetoed. But if it hadn't been vetoed, because bills like that come together so quickly, a lot of times there's mistakes, there's, contradictory things in that bill that make something hard to implement. So then they'll pass like a housekeeping bill that cleans up language and makes sure that, they're pointing to the right statutes. Because the people who are working at the Capitol, often toward the end of session, are working without any sleep and on lots of coffee, and so they make mistakes like the rest of us, and so a lot of times we have to go back and correct those mistakes. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is about, an omnibus bill, which is, Minnesota has a law that bills should be what they call single subject. So for, traditionally, the legislature has passed bills kind of like grouped together by topic. Like, here's all the bills on health, and so it's the health omnibus bill. Or here's all the bills on civil law, and that's a civil law omnibus bill. But recently, like probably within the last couple decades, there's been this trend towards, putting a lot of different things in a bill that aren't single subject, and that's, to be determined whether or not that's actually against the law. But we hear a lot of complaining about it at the end of every session, and I think it's still to be determined whether or not that practice will continue. Any other questions? Okay. I don't know how much time I have now that we've, does anybody know how much time we have for this, now that we've kind of adjusted schedules? Okay. Okay, yeah. So what would influence a legislator to vote for or against some legislation? These are some of the things we think about. How big is the problem, and does it have a practical solution? There are some things that are problems, but maybe a legislative solution isn't the best solution. So we want to make sure that the solution fits the problem. What impact does it have on that legislator's district? How much does it cost? That's a big one with a lot of the work we do in Health and Human Services. Does this have a price tag, and what is that price tag? Who cares about it? That can include businesses, organizations, individuals, and then constituents. Do their constituents care about this issue? What does the media say about this? Has there been a lot of media buzz about it? Does the issue affect me personally? You'd be surprised how many legislators, really look at a lot of what they support through a personal lens. I mean, maybe you wouldn't be surprised. Sometimes I'm surprised because, I walk in as like, we're the Cancer Society. We got all these like facts and numbers, and, everybody hates cancer, right? And a lot of times the response we get is like, well, I have this friend who, quit. The one we hear a lot lately is they quit smoking by using e-cigarettes. So we wouldn't want to, ban the use of e-cigarettes for kids because they're actually good for you. And it's like, well, we have a lot of data that shows that maybe they're not so great. But a lot of that looking at things through that personal lens, the people that they know, the things that they've heard, the things that have happened to them. What do my constituents say? So the people who vote for them, loom pretty large in their eyes, and so they want to know a lot of times what their constituents think about an issue. And then, will this help me get reelected, and how will it help with my fundraising? So out of all of those, what what do you guys think might be the most important factor? I heard, what do my constituents say? What the fundraising or get reelected? Any other guesses? Sorry, what? Money. We find that it's most often, what do my constituents say? So a lot of times we think about how, you know, a lot of the influence in politics comes from money, those people that can write big checks. And I think the reason, you know, we generally have been successful in the policies that we push. We can't write checks, we can't endorse candidates, but we can get a lot of constituents to say, we think this is a good idea, or we think this is a bad idea. And even legislators who might not totally be on board with what the policy is that we're working on, will still sometimes vote the way we want them to, because we've gotten enough of their constituents to reach out and say, this is something that's important to me. So what can you do to reach out to your legislator? What's some ways to do that? The most important part is that you're there to tell your story. You know, I think, like we talked about earlier, the process can seem intimidating. It can seem like, you know, you're going to mess up, or you're not going to say the right thing, or, you know, they're going to ask you a question that you can't answer. But you're the expert on your story. You have the personal experience, or the professional experience or connection to an issue that's going to make you the best voice on that issue. And so I try to tell my advocates that they're, you know, not to be intimidated, because they're the ones who can tell their story in the best way. And we'll practice doing a little storytelling in a minute here, but I just want to acknowledge that it can be intimidating, you know, that you are walking into an unfamiliar place with people who seem very big and powerful, but they're actually usually not the expert in what you're talking them to. For example, I was trying to think of dental related examples, the sharp thingy that you use to clean my teeth. I have no idea what that's called. I'm sure it has a name. And I'm sure everybody in this room knows exactly what that's called. But I don't know what it is, and neither do probably most of those legislators, right? So just by you walking in and having that kind of knowledge in front of a lawmaker, you know, already they're going oh, you know this stuff, you know what you're talking about. You know, just know that you're the expert in the issues that you're talking about, not the lawmaker. They have to know a little bit about a whole bunch of things, and so they depend on folks like you, professionals, advocates, constituents, to help educate them on those things that they need to know about on issues, and really going deep on those issues. There's many different ways to get your story across. You can send an email, you can make a phone call, you can post on social media and tag your lawmakers, or post on their social media sites. You can write a letter to the editor in the newspaper. You can talk to them in person, meet them in your district or at the Capitol, or you can even testify in front of a committee. What do you think is the most effective, meaningful way to connect with lawmakers? Yeah, probably in person. I'd say it's probably a tie between in person and testifying in front of a committee. Although letters to the editor can be surprisingly effective. Lawmakers pore over their local papers looking for their names. So if you can really get their attention by getting a letter to the editor published saying, I sure hope Senator Smith would vote for this thing, or I was really disappointed to see that Senator Smith didn't vote for this thing. So that's a tactic we use a lot to try and get the attention of lawmakers, especially if you can put the city that you're from in the signature and they know that you're a constituent, because they know that not only are you the one or are they the one that's seeing it, they know that other constituents are also seeing that message. So I wanted to just talk briefly about one of our volunteers and how she used her story to get a pretty significant piece of legislation passed. This is Kayla. She's in her mid-20s, a working professional, but at the time that she worked on our tobacco tax campaign, she was a college student. She had lost her dad to esophageal cancer when she was 14 years old, and she had gotten involved with us because of her dad passing away and that it had really affected her. So she was actually willing to testify in front of the legislature when the tobacco tax increase was working its way through in 2013. It's very controversial. Raising taxes is always controversial, and it was a pretty big bump that was being proposed, $1.60 per pack, which would have been at the time it was the biggest increase in a tobacco tax in the country. And it was very broadly applied. It applied to all types of tobacco products, including things like e-cigarettes and other newer products, which is unusual to apply taxes that broadly. So it was pretty controversial, but she was able to tell her story in front of the tax committee. And we watched, obviously, while she was doing that, and she talked about how she her dad wasn't going to be there. Her dad wasn't there to take pictures at her prom, and her dad wasn't there to see her, won't be there to see her to graduate, and her dad won't be there to walk her down the aisle. And, we just started to see the tears come into those lawmakers' eyes, and she's tearing up, and they're tearing up. And, I really think that her story was a big part of why that bill kept passing through committee. I mean, there were also other factors, right? There was a big budget deficit that needed to be addressed, and this was a great way to fill that hole. But there were other ways that could have been done. There could have been more cuts made. There are other places maybe to raise some taxes. But, I think this was a really impactful part of why the tobacco tax increase passed in the end. I'll also say that Governor Dayton, before he was elected, said that he wouldn't sign the tobacco tax increase because he thought it was too aggressive of a tax. And so Kayla's story was one of the reasons why he really moved towards saying, yeah, this is something we need to do. So, and she just, all she knew was her story. She was a college kid. She didn't have all this background on tax policy or tobacco policy. Her job was to tell her story, and she did it beautifully and in a heartfelt way, and that really was the most effective way for her to use her voice to get this law passed. So I want to just quickly go over what's in your story. We want to make sure that you tell a few things. You want to say who you are. You want to say where you're from, because you want to make sure they know that you're a constituent. And if you're not a constituent, why are you there? You want to tell them what you want, what your issue is. You want to tell them why your issue is important. And that's really about connecting with your story. And then you always want to end with asking, will they support or oppose that position? You want to get them to commit to a position. Lawmakers are very, very skilled at not answering that question, right? They will do their best to try and wiggle out of it. They'll change the subject. They'll try and distract you. Oftentimes they'll say, well, I have to do a little bit more research. I have to ask my constituents. I'll get back to you. But the most important thing is to, at some point, pin them down on their answer to that question, preferably before they actually vote on it. You don't want to be surprised when you get to the point of them voting on it and they haven't told you yet, and then all of a sudden that's where you learn which way they're voting. So if I was going to do a pitch, and again, these a lot of times when you're meeting with lawmakers, you don't have a ton of time, so you want to be as succinct as possible. So here's my pitch. I wrote it down, which is fine. You can always write things down and read them right off pieces of paper. So my name is Ellie Beaver. I'm from St. Paul. I'm asking you to support Minnesota Oral Health Day. Oral health is more important to overall health than most people realize. Good oral health helps control the bacteria that lives in your mouth that without care can lead to infection and decay. Oral Health Day will help raise awareness of the importance of oral health and encourage more people to visit their oral health care provider and be consistent with their good oral hygiene practices, like brushing and flossing. Will you vote in favor of our bill to declare February 17th Minnesota Oral Health Day? Done. So pretty simple. I tried to like connect back to why it's important. I didn't have like a super strong personal connection. I mean, I guess I could talk about my daughter and, wrestling her into that chair and making sure she has, good oral health for the rest of her life. But thinking of like those connections back to, the personal or some very brief facts about the issue that you're advocating for is really a helpful way to get your story across. So I thought we could just take a few minutes to practice that. Would you guys be okay with that? If you want to get into like groups of 2, 3, 4, and just think about what your story might be to advocate for a Minnesota Oral Health Day. And I'll put up the list again. Does anybody want to share their pitch? If you had time to create one, I can give you the microphone.
Sorry, I'm not very articulate, and I just thought of it. But, okay, I will say quickly what my pitch is. And I just want to tell you the background that we have a school sealant program, and a lot of kids suffer from oral health disease, and they're not learning as well. So this is what I'm going to say to the legislator. My name is Ann Copeland. I'm from Community Dental Care. We have a school sealant program in a number of our low-income schools in your district. And a lot of people are very concerned about how well kids succeed in school, but they don't realize that oral disease is the most common disease, non-communicable disease in the world, and that a lot of our children in your schools, in your district, are suffering from this. And I would like you to know how important it is to tackle that. And so I would like to have your support for this bill.
Great, thank you. That was great. I love how you tied it back to, that this is an issue that affects your constituents. It's local. It's a big problem. That was great. Perfect pitch. Thank you, Ann. Well, that is the end of my presentation. Whoops, that was the wrong way. There, yeah. This is my contact information. The American Cancer Society, Cancer Action Network doesn't do oral health policy exactly, but I was so excited to listen to the presentation on HPV vaccination, which is something that we care a lot about. We also do a ton of work on tobacco policy, and I know you know that tobacco use contributes to poor oral health, and so if you're ever interested in getting involved with us, I'm happy to talk with you about it. This is my contact information. You can go to our website at fightcancer.org/MN, and I really appreciate the chance to talk to you all today, and thank you for your participation.